Hello, friends. Patrick McFarland here of the Liberty Weekly podcast, coming at you with another episode. This one is episode 183, and the show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/183. And joining me again is Keith Knight. How's it going, man?
It's going pretty well, Pat. Thanks for having me back.
Of course, man. It's been a hot minute since we've talked and done an episode together. But I think in this episode, we're going to be revisiting what I think is kind of a classic in this whole, I don't want to call it false flag, but it's like war propaganda and war lies. And this was what, actually reading this piece is what turned me on to this Uyghur genocide issue. So what is the piece and how did you come across it?
I had to have come across it when Curtis Yarvin was on my show and he mentioned Falsehood in Wartime by, I can't pronounce this name for the life of me. Arthur Ponsonby. Is that how you would say it? Yeah.
You're right.
Okay. That was when I came across it, and it was written in 1928. That was the most interesting thing. So often these things are written about decades later when there's not a whole lot of pressure. But right when the war had ended in 1918, 1919, around that time, there were still tons of veterans that this guy would have known directly at the time. There's a lot of pressure to just sort of, hey, I disagreed with it, but you don't want to hurt the feelings of the troops and their families. I mean, think of speaking out against Iraq and Afghanistan as nothing compared to what was happening in, America, alone with the Wilson administration locking people up at the time. I'm not sure about, he vaguely mentions that there was censorship in all countries. That's too vague to know if people are getting caged for this kind of stuff, but I can't imagine there was exactly a free-spirited debate in the parliaments of Europe about the First World War. So, yeah, Yarvin brought it to my attention. And then, the fact that the Afghanistan war, the 20-year war, was based on a lie that we have to go fight people who hate us for our freedom, when the reality is, as I showed in a recent video I did, I titled it 99% of neocons still believe this lie, that the reason is there is Islamic terrorism. Well, has nothing to do with Islam. It has everything to do with blowback and the support for Israel, occupation of Saudi Arabia, and the imposition of an embargo in Iraq starting in 91. So the fact that we're still experiencing lies to this day is what gave me the idea to bring this up.
Yeah, and just as a side note, Tulsi Gabbard had a really, really bad tweet about that. I don't know if you saw that.
Yes, I did. She like explicitly said this is about Islamic fundamentalism, and it's like blaming the Iraq war and Afghanistan on Christianity. It's like, yeah, a lot of the politicians will say, "In God we trust," and they'll identify as Christians. You might think that it has something to do with Christianity, but it's actually the religion of statism.
Yeah, and our buddies Kyle Anzalone and Will Porter covered that on Conflicts of Interest just the other day. So I'd tune into that for sure. But especially you were commenting kind of on the whole footing during World War I, especially in Great Britain. I was doing like a little bit of a documentary on COVID-19 and the parallels to the war footing in Great Britain during World War I. And there's a lot to be said about the conscientious objectors and what they endured during that time. People being put in prison and for refusing to go and fight and kill in the war. Not to mention, all the public support and I forget what it was called, the Poppy campaign, where British men had to, if a British man was walking down the street during the war, women were encouraged in a PR campaign, to go up to them and put like a poppy or some kind of a flower to show that they were cowards, to guilt them into going to fight. And it was so, Corbett talks about this in his Echoes of World War I presentation, and it was so successful that they actually had to stop the campaign because there were men who were at home who were working in the factories that were part of the war effort that were being like berated in the street by women. So anyways, you just get this whole footing, this crazed public, and I think there's so many parallels to World War I.
Yeah, it's amazing. So right now, OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, we're always hearing about how we need OSHA or workers won't be protected. And then you just get these blatant examples of governments sending millions of citizens into wars based on lies that are, they're not even in the national interest, which is what the lie so often is. I mean, Adam Smith proved that empires are too expensive because they benefit the few at the expense of the many. So even if you're a nationalist, let's do this for the homeland, and you're not even caring about the non-aggression principle, it's still not worth it. So again, you have governments committing the very same atrocity that they say might possibly happen if there is a free market. They treat workers worse than any private business could ever dream of.
And before we get started, like on the Ponsonby bit, I wanted to share this. And this is, I was working on a documentary about COVID and making these parallels. And I wanted to highlight this fog of war effect that we noticed during COVID when that started. And Ponsonby talks about that in the introduction. But primarily, when the World Health Organization announced and named COVID-19, they did so introducing it immediately as this being a war, that we're doing a war on the virus and the virus is public enemy number one. So
yeah, whenever they come up with a name for something, that's when you really want to start being scared. Like if they were calling it the Spying on Innocent People Tyranny Act, it never could have gone through. But the fact that they named it the Patriot Act is why it's never going away. The fact that they named it Operation Iraqi Freedom is how you're getting the average idiot to support something so ridiculous. As far as calling it a war on anything, we saw the same thing with Winston Churchill in 1945. He said, "Now that we've won the war, we're going to mobilize and do the same thing to combat homelessness and to combat poverty." So again, we have the state using future justifications are just past justifications again. What they're going to use to justify anything they do in the future, they'll just say they've done it in the past. They won't even justify it in the first place. Justin Trudeau is now doing it. He's saying, we're going to organize to do just like the war on COVID. We're going to do this with, he mentioned homelessness, and of course he mentioned climate change, and he mentioned poverty and immigration and helping the third world. So, it's too bad that these narratives, not only are they false, but they're the primary things used for further state actions that everyone else would otherwise just disregard.
All right, sorry about that. I don't know why the screen closed on me, but here we go.
We have a name for the disease, and it is COVID-19. A virus can have more powerful consequences than any terrorist action, and that's true. And if the world doesn't want to wake up and consider this enemy virus as public enemy number one, I don't think we will learn from our lessons. For instance, the first vaccine could be ready in 18 months. So we have to do everything today using the available weapon to fight this virus, while preparing for the long term using the preparation for the vaccines. We have to use the current window of opportunity to hit hard and stand in unison to fight this virus in every corner. If we don't, we could have far more cases and far higher costs on our hands. And I don't think anybody wants that.
What? So you do see that war footing. I don't know if he explicitly said that it was war, but he's using very militant language to describe it.
Of course, yeah. But if we don't give the state tons of power, people are going to die. Well, where did this virus come from? I mean, apparently it started with bats in the wet market. So that would mean you'd want to keep people out away from the outside because it's a virus used to living outside in bats. But it turns out it transfers more from person to person inside. Are bats inside more than they're outside? I think that's unlikely. This might have been a lab leak. Of course, that they already have the foregone conclusion. All right, we need tons of more power. Now, what is the reason for this? Terrorism, homelessness, inequality, sexism, racism. I think the weather's different than it was yesterday. Okay, climate change. We'll call that a reason too. Anything under the sun they use as a justification.
Okay, so to get into the actual the lies that Ponsonby outlines, first I'll start off with this Belgian baby without hands story. And this was a story that was promulgated throughout Europe and Great Britain, especially at the beginning of the war, because as the Germans were marching through Belgium, there were all these stories coming out about German atrocities that were taking place. And one of the most famous ones was the Belgian baby without hands. And this was talked about a lot. It was talked about in the newspapers at the time. And one of the problems is that after the war, they couldn't, the British MPs and the Pope actually were looking to find some of these Belgian babies without hands because they wanted to take care of them. And they had heard all these stories and felt really bad. So the British Parliament sent out people to Europe to find these babies, and they couldn't find a single baby that didn't have hands. And part of it, people didn't even think about it. They were like, okay, well, how long could a child survive with their hands chopped off? I mean, I'm sure they would die without medical attention within the first like 10 or so minutes. And part of the reason it makes sense is, or it doesn't make sense, is because all these stories had talked about all of these babies and children that were walking around Belgium without hands. So and all of this was in the major newspapers. You have the Sunday Chronicle in Great Britain. You have the London Times. You have La Rive Rouge, which I think is it sounds like a French newspaper. And so all of this is kind of like secondhand. So the Times correspondent in Belgium on August 27th, 1914 said, "One man whom I did not see told an official of the Catholic Society that he had seen with his own eyes German soldiery chop off the arms of a baby which clung to its mother's skirts." And of course, I don't know if this is hearsay within hearsay, but this is definitely hearsay. And this was used, so one of the newspapers said in a picture in the newspaper, in the Sphere, there was a picture of the Kaiser depicted standing behind a huge block with an axe, his hands darkly stained with blood. Round the block are piles of hands. He is beckoning to a woman to bring a number of children who are clinging to her, some having had their hands cut off already. And so all of the evidence given to the British Parliament contained, quote, "as seen by witnesses." And so that was, it's still very, I think it's sophisticated propaganda for the time, but it's not as sophisticated as what we see today.
Yeah, and instead of eyewitness sources, they just say anonymous sources now. It's equally as fake. Yeah, certainly they've had to up their game over the years.
So maybe it's not as sophisticated. Maybe I misspoke.
I'm not sure. I always wonder, what did the average person know way back then? What did they think? I have no clue. You certainly read the letters of, guys in the Civil War, and you're like, wow, they had some intellect back then at the time. I'm really not sure, but you'd have to think that if baby's hands cut off, constant bleeding, yeah, that's probably not accurate. But hey, we fell for Gaddafi's Viagra treatment story that Wolf Blitzer on CNN was pushing. So that I'm not standing on too much high ground here. My first takeaway is from the introduction. He says, when war reaches such dimensions as to involve the whole nation, and when people, at its conclusion, find they have gained nothing but only observe widespread calamity around them, they are inclined to become more skeptical and desire to investigate the foundations of the arguments which inspired their patriotism, inflamed their passions, and prepared them to offer the supreme sacrifice. Now, what this is saying generally in the introduction is, if you want to sell someone something and you want them to like spend $100, you might really have to exaggerate the benefits of the product or service if you want to get someone to spend $100 or $1,000 or 10,000. Well, if you want someone to get gassed and get their like mustard gas, get their arms, limbs blown off and lose access to their sons and daughters maybe, well, you really have to sell them on this. Why he calls it the supreme sacrifice. There's almost nothing above something like this. So this is his general justification for why is it that in every country we see massive deception in war. We see a lot of lies in a lot of other places, but especially wartime. Why is it we continually see this? And the answer is you have some people benefiting at the expense of others. And in order to reap such a benefit from getting someone to give the supreme sacrifice, putting their life on the line, you really have to exaggerate what's going to happen. So what we see, I think he has like 25 instances of just terrible atrocity propaganda that there's virtually no evidence that any of these existed. So that I thought was a great thesis as to why we always see lies in wartime, because you can always say, well, there's people who are just conspiracy theorists. They just don't believe anything the government says. Well, there's actually good reason to, because they're asking people to commit such sacrifice. They have every incentive to lie. And when they're caught lying, there's no real ramifications. So that was my first big takeaway.
Yeah, and like I was saying, just to add to that, it's like the mechanism they do it is this fog of war. And it's pretty easy for them to do it because no one really knows what the truth is. And that's what makes it really hard to, in the work I've done with the Libertarian Institute and like on the Uyghur issue, is that I don't know what's going on in Xinjiang. I'm just looking at the evidence and trying to, the burden of proof is on these people saying that atrocities are being committed because of the implications of that charge. And so it's like, well, I don't know what's going on there, but there's not evidence for that. So, but then, the accusations come out and they're published as truth. They're published definitively, and the retractions never come. And if they do come, they come later and they're on page B12 or something, of the newspaper. So the other one, the next one that I wanted to talk about is the nurses, the mutilated nurse. And this was a story that went about in Great Britain. And there was a letter that came to a sister that was supposedly from her other sister who was a nurse in Belgium. And this letter that was written as if it was written by someone who was a nurse with this girl's sister in Belgium, saying that the nurse sister had been raped by German soldiers, that her breasts were cut off, and that she died and suffered in extreme agony. And this letter was printed in the Star on September 16th, 1914. It was titled "The Nurse's Tragedy, Dumfries Girl, the Victim of Shocking Barbarity." It says, her breasts were cut off, she died in great agony. Nurse Hume, her family, the victim, Nurse Hume, her family received a note written shortly before she died. It was dated September 6th and ran, "Dear Kate, this is to say goodbye. I have not long to live. Hospital has been set on fire. Germans cruel. A man here had his head cut off. My right breast has been taken away. Give my love to Roderick. Goodbye, Grace." And so it turns out that the whole story was made up, that the sister who was still in the UK, who was allegedly the recipient of this letter, had made up the entire story, and she was actually charged in court for the fake story. So it's not that every single story is an insidious, propaganda plot created by the warmongers. It's that they could happen upon something and it's taken out of context. The newspapers run with it because, they have their incentive. That's not to say that war propaganda isn't manufactured, but I think in this case, it really was just a girl that wanted attention. And so she made up this story, and all the newspapers ran with it. And I'm sure that, they made money from it, and the war effort was, it was supplemented.
Yeah, that one was just horrible to read, especially when the source for a lot of these atrocities are personal letters. Those were the most difficult to get through. I got my next one I thought was just fascinating because it was from, he's citing David Lloyd George, Chamberlain. He cites Churchill in the book, and he cites President Woodrow Wilson on September 5th, 1919. Wilson says, "Is there any man or woman, let me say, is there any child who does not know that the seed of war in the modern world is industrial and commercial rivalry? This was an industrial and commercial war." Now, I am very curious as to the accuracy of that quote. Whenever I look it up, it certainly is verified on as far as what you can get from a quote from a guy 100 years ago. Heaven knows if it was really in a newspaper, maybe the newspaper's fake. Either way, it is incredible that you have well recognized people having such blatant quotes like this, because as people like Pat Buchanan will say, this was obviously Britain fearing the rise of Germany as the superpower in Europe. So they declared war on Germany as a result. And they, didn't want to, France to be influenced by the Germans. But either way, you have a president of America 100 years ago saying, watch out, there's commercial interests at stake here. Then we have a World War II general and president of America Eisenhower saying that there's commercial interests here. And, well, even before that, you had Smedley Butler from the First World War saying that war is a racket and actually meant for some people to make money at the expense of others. Also, Donald Trump has mentioned the military-industrial complex by name. So the fact that we have so much evidence on our side, that we have so many quality quotes on our side, that we're not just theorists who are guessing about things, but that was mind-blowing, that even in 1928, there was still evidence that some of the most powerful, well-connected people in the world who would be in a position to know such a thing, it was recognized that they knew exactly what wars were.
So my next piece here is the Louvain altarpiece. So this is the next story. It says, Ponsonby says, at the peace conference, the Belgian representatives claimed the wings of Dietrich Bout's altarpiece in compensation for the famous altarpiece from Louvain, a valuable work of art which they declared had been wantonly thrown into the flames of the burning library by a German officer. The story was accepted and the two pictures transferred, but it was not true. The New Statesman of April 12, 1924, after the war, gives the facts. So the Dietrich Bout's altarpiece was not thrown into the flames by the Germans or by anyone else. The picture is still in existence at Louvain, perfectly intact, and the Germans were not its destroyers, but its preservers. A German officer saved it from the flames and gave it to the burgomaster, who had it taken for safe custody to the vaults of the town hall and walled in there. It has been duly unwalled. So, of course, there was a more charitable explanation. German officers actually took this priceless artifact and stored it away so it would survive the war. And people thought it would disappear. It disappeared because they just didn't know about it. So it's easy when you, and I think this has been said a lot about the COVID situation, is that it's human evolutionary psychology that when you are put into a fear state, your fight or flight response kicks in. And when you're doing that, you're like, say that you're in the woods and you run into a bear. Well, you get scared as all hell and your fight or flight response kicks in and you probably run away if you're smart. And as you're running away, you don't stop to like appreciate how nice of a day it is or how pretty the trees look or anything like that. You're just running. You can't focus on any other thing aside from getting out of there. And all of your body's instincts and bodily functions go towards extricating yourself from that situation. So one thing is that your higher level thought kicks off. And this is a perfect example of it. Everyone is caught up in war fervor. They don't think of what the simplest explanation is for this piece of art being gone. All of a sudden, of course, it's those Germans, those Huns, and that's what happens. Chief?
My next one is the Lusitania. This was great because, again, In 1928, he's writing about this, whereas in 2021, people still believe the lie that the Lusitania was hit by the Germans who wanted to provoke us into war, and then we went to war. Again, there's 2 years in between the sinking of the Lusitania and the declaration of war, or the U.S. going into the war in 1917 after Woodrow Wilson is reelected. Well, once he gets elected again, then he has a plan to enslave half of America. So of course, it's just like, well, we need to go into Iraq because they have WMDs. They scare you into going, and then you go, well, really, it's about democracy and setting up a stable organization. And even now, it's like not even about Al Qaeda. Biden mentioned Al Qaeda for like the first time in years at the end of his Afghanistan speech. The general justification is, well, the Taliban is so horrible. Yeah, they're horrible, but that was not your initial justification in 2001. Okay, so the Lusitania, there's a lot to get in here, but he says that there's 4 claims about the Lusitania that need to go on. One, the most important one was that this was just a group of civilians. It was more or less sort of like the Titanic, just some people going towards another geographical location, and then the Germans just bombed it. Well, he says that there were 5,400 cases of ammunition on board, seeking to go from America all the way to Britain to fund the war effort. And he actually quotes Winston Churchill from The World in Crisis. So Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty at the time. So if anyone knew what was going on in the high seas, it would probably be Winston Churchill. So Churchill says, included in her cargo, the Lusitania, was a small consignment of rifle ammunition, which sharpened shells weighed about 173 tons. Warning that the vessel would be sunk afterwards, traits to the German government were circulated in New York before she sailed. So Germany was saying, don't get on the Lusitania. We, of course, know this because of the excellent work of James Perloff. Not that he originated it, but he certainly kept it alive. And so we have 2 things there. We have the Lusitania was armed. It was not just civilians. They constantly do this. America was just isolationist, minding its own business, and then 9/11 happened out of nowhere. Pearl Harbor happened out of nowhere. The Lusitania happened out of nowhere, because there's such evil in the world. Therefore, in response to any of this evil, no matter what we do, it's pretty much justified. And if you object to anything, well, you're kind of simping for these pure evil people who just attack innocent people for no reason. Of course, that is not the case. You can even go to Churchill's own words for that. So that was my third one, the Lusitania.
Okay, so my next one, and I have 2 more, Keith, but this one is so reminiscent of the babies in incubators story from Iraq War I. And this one is called The Baby of Corbec Lou. And Ponsonby writes, it's not too often that we have a confession of falsehood, but the story of the baby of Corbec Lou is an illuminating example of an invention related by its author. Captain F.W. Wilson, formerly editor of the Sunday Times, related the story in America in 1922. The following account appeared in the New York Times, was reproduced in the Crusader. Quote, a correspondent of the London Daily Mail, Captain Wilson, found himself in Brussels at the time the war broke out. They telegraphed out that they wanted stories of atrocities. So you have direct, right here, you have an admission that the press talks to their correspondents and says, get us stories of atrocities. Well, there weren't any atrocities at that time. So then they telegraphed out that they wanted stories of refugees. So I said to myself, that's fine. I won't have to move because there's refugees all over. There was a little town outside Brussels where one went to get dinner, a very good dinner too. I heard the Hun had been there. I suppose there may have been a baby there, so I wrote a heartrending story about the baby of Corbec Lou being rescued from the Hun in the light of the burning homesteads. The next day, they telegraphed out to me to send the baby along, as they had about 5,000 letters offering to adopt the baby. 5,000 letters. The day after that, baby clothes began to pour into the office. Even Queen Alexandra wired her sympathy and sent some clothes. Well, the problem was I couldn't wire back to them that there wasn't a baby. I couldn't say that. So I finally arranged with the doctor that took care of the refugees that the blessed baby died of some very contagious disease, so it couldn't even have a public burial. And he says, we got Lady Northcliffe to start a creche with all the baby clothes. I'm probably mispronouncing that. So now, Keith, I'm going to rely on you here, but the babies and incubators testimony, I know I've talked about this on the show before, but it turns out, wasn't it the United States ambassador to Kuwait? It was his daughter that they had hired a PR firm to coach her and to give testimony to the Foreign Relations Committee about this.
Yeah, I forget her last name, but her name was Nayaria. So it's referred to as the Nayaria testimony.
Mm-hmm.
She faked being a nurse there. And that was in 1991. So it's not like this is just in the old primitive days, people used to lie about things and get away with it. It still happens. And they were hired by an organization called Hill and Knowlton. So that is an example of just atrocities going on. It was mentioned not only by 7 senators in America, it was mentioned multiple times by the president, George Bush Sr. Himself. So, I mean, it was like right when they lost the boogeyman of the Soviet Union, they had to turn their back on a former ally, Saddam Hussein, who Rumsfeld is shaking hands with years earlier, to sell them weapons to fight Iran, even though they're selling weapons to Iran in the oh my God, I can't even think of the name. The Iranian the weapons scandal where they're selling weapons to Iran to fund the Contras. Yeah, Iran Contra. So I mean, wars are just, I mean, the worst types of lies that lead to the worst amounts of atrocities.
Hang on a sec there, Keith. Hey, everybody, and welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. Before we get into that, though, I have some announcements to make. So in the last episode, I was alluding to an event that I had cooking and planned that goes along with nullifying COVID-19 measures. And what I did is I set up an event. I called a local person that I knew that was on kind of our side of the issue. He was gracious enough to open up his venue to a private event that we had planned. And we circulated the news of this event kind of just by word of mouth. And last week I came out with a poster advertising this event when we set the date. That date is Wednesday, so in 2 days. This will be releasing Monday night on September 20th. So just by word of mouth, we started calling people either the next day or the day after, so 2 days after we had announced it. And when we were calling people, people already knew about the event because they had heard about it from 2 or 3 other people. And I think the reaction was just incredible. And people were calling the venue off the hook. The phone was off the hook. It's been off the hook for ever since we announced the event. And we're expecting way more people than we thought we would get. And we're setting up a PA system. And essentially what's going to happen is that I'm going to speak at this event. And there are no other speakers that are lined up to speak at this event. Longtime listeners of the podcast will know that I spoke at I think Agorafest in the Twin Cities, or the Agora Symposium in the Twin Cities. But that was to a group of maybe 8 or 9 people. There will be more than 100 people at this event is what we're expecting. So I'm working on a speech. Apologize for getting an episode out a little bit late. I plan to share the speech on the podcast with some details redacted, but I'm going to be giving a report about the speech, and maybe I'll release that as kind of a standalone episode that I'll just do an audio version or a video version I'll release maybe Thursday. So we're pretty excited. Just the response has been incredible, and I think that this is emblematic of the fact that everyone is just kind of sitting around kind of waiting for someone to do something. And I think that us as libertarians need to be the ones who do something about it. And most of the people that are coming to this event, I'm anticipating, will be conservative. However, I'm a libertarian, and I'll be up there putting things in their ear. And I'm just really excited, a little nervous, to be honest, but I think that this will be a great time for liberty in north central Wisconsin. And I think we're really going to kick this off. And people are excited. People are fired up about this. And it's great news, and it's a shimmer of hope for a lot of people that are just very worried, as you and I are, about what's happening in this country and what's happening in the world. So we're going to give them a life raft. We're going to give them, like, what do they call that? The thing you throw out when you're a lifeguard, a life preserver, what have you. So we'll see how that goes. Really excited about that. Wanted to share that with you. And wanted to also share the best way that it is for you to support this content. That's at libertyweekly.net/support. Here's the tab right here on the website for those of you watching. You can go here and you can find all these different methods to help support this show. I have an Amazon wish list. I have Patreon bonuses for cryptocurrency at float.app. I got PayPal for now, Patreon, Subscribestar, and I have all of my cryptocurrency addresses. So you know how crypto is crashing right now? Well, send some of your cheap crypto over to me, and I'll take it off your hands gladly. So also, non-monetary support is just telling people about this content, subscribing to it, rating it, reviewing it, sharing it on social media, doing all those things to get the word out about the work that I'm doing here, which I believe is great work. I've heard other people say it's great work, but I put a lot of time and effort into it to make sure that you're learning something, to try and make it interesting, and to try and equip us with this knowledge that we can take into battle, because that's what we're doing. Also, you can support on rockfin.com. This is probably the most bang for your buck. $10 a month gets you access to all of the regular and all of the premium content from a bunch of these great creators. I name them off on the show all the time. Most notably is Monica Perez and Brad Binkley from the Propaganda Report. But people like Abby Martin, Ben Norton, Jimmy Dore, The Conscious Resistance, Richard Grove, Ryan Christian with The Last American Vagabond, Jason Burmis, our friends Kyle Anzalone and Will Porter from Conflicts of Interest, and Joanne Leone from Around the Empire. Also, The Ripple Effect, Unlimited Hangout with Whitney Webb. So all these people are available for a low monthly subscription fee of $10 per month. I think thousands of hours of bonus content here at your fingertips. You can also support me on Odyssey. We'll go to my channel here on odyssey.com or libertyweekly.net/Odyssey. You get all my content, but I also am posting bonus content here that you can buy a la carte for cryptocurrency. You can see that on the screen here, bonus content with Kyle Anzalone and Will Porter. And so we do that. You can pick the episodes you want to watch for LBC. I really do value LBC. So if you want to send that to me, buy my content with it, please go ahead and do that. All right, so that's about it. I'm excited to let you know how this event goes, and we'll be talking more about it. We'll be talking more about the reaction to it and the steps that people are taking, and give you updates on what we're doing to fight back. All right, thanks a lot. Back to the show.
Did you have anything else on that, or should I go with my next one?
Nope, fire away, bud.
I loved this chapter titled War Aims on page 160. He says, so here are a number of the war aims, the alleged war aims, and these are all based on lies. Now, he goes to a war to end war, a war safe for democracy. My favorite one is no territory for Great Britain. So really, Great Britain is doing this to defend the small state of Belgium. Great Britain's not in it for themselves. This is not about greed. It's about protecting others. So what they end up doing, so Great Britain in 1914 is already 13 million square miles of the Earth's surface. Not exactly the Athenian democracy that people so often say they love. Here is what happened after the war in 1919. They increased their territory quite a bit. They took over Egypt, 350,000 square miles, Cyprus, German Southwest Africa, German East Africa, Togoland and the Cameroons, Samoa, German New Guinea and the island of South Equator, Palestine, the mandate by Great Britain of Arthur Balfour in 1917, and Mesopotamia, a land we refer to as Iraq, increasing the British Empire by 1,415,929 square miles. So when you see the U.S. declaring war on Iraq and then Halliburton stock drastically increasing, of which Dick Cheney still owns stock in at the time, of course, they're constantly self-interested wars. I think Tom Sowell had the great quote that politics is the study of people pretending their self-interest is national interest. And once you realize that that's all it is, and wars are the worst manifestation of that, as bad as, the minimum wage and regulation is, and the state monopolizing the currency is even worse. The wars, certainly if they were happening in America, if every time there was one of these, terrible mass shootings, if they were sanctioned by large-scale governments that had the power to continue to do them, we would think they're even worse than they already are. So, war is not only the health of the state. The state is also the health of war, because you can't opt out of funding it. So they have no incentive to really economize on defeating whoever the enemy may or not be. You can't have this idea that, well, I support government, but I'm really against the wars. It's the equivalent of saying, I really support giving the Klan trillions of dollars, but sometimes it seems like they treat some races differently than the others. No, you don't get that excuse after all this time. So, that was my fourth one. I just thought that was incredible. They increased their total supply of land by like 10% on a war that's to protect Belgium. Crazy stuff.
So this is my favorite war lie, if you could have one of those. However, this one is called the Corpse Factory, and this is my last example here from Ponsonby's work. But this is, a lot of people don't believe this because I mentioned it on like several podcast interviews that I've done. So Ponsonby writes, this series of extracts will give the record of one of the most revolting lies invented during the war, the dissemination of which throughout not only this country but the world was encouraged and connived at by both the government and the press. It started in 1917 and was not finally disposed of until 1925. He says most of these quotations given are from the Times, the Times of London, I believe it is. So, quote, one of the United States consuls on leaving Germany in February 1917 stated in Switzerland that the Germans were distilling glycerin from the bodies of their dead. This claim that I just said was printed April 16, 1917. Herr Karl Rosner, the correspondent of the Berlin Lokalanzeiger on the Western Front, published that last Tuesday the first definite German admission concerning the way in which the Germans use dead bodies. Here's another quotation. We passed through Evering Court. There's a dull smell in the air, as if lime were being burnt. We are passing the great corpse exploitation establishment of this army group. The fat that is won here is turned into lubricating oils, and everything else is ground down in the bone mill into a powder which is used for mixing with pig's food and as manure. Nothing can be permitted to go to waste. That was printed in the Times that same day, April 16, 1917. So he recounts all of these different reports, which was supposedly firsthand testimony, people seeing the corpse factory and talking about, and all of these supposed admissions from German officials about what they would do to the corpses of their dead. And none of it was true. And in fact, Ponsonby includes a kind of a prolonged inquest by the British Parliament, saying that basically there's no real evidence that this exists aside from, eyewitness testimony, which as an attorney, I can tell you that eyewitness testimony is the least reliable form of evidence. However, it is also the most convincing form of evidence, and eyewitness testimony constitutes much. If you go back and go to like a lot of the reasons why people are wrongfully convicted, it is eyewitness identification. So someone will say, oh, this usually African-American man snuck into my bedroom and raped me. And it's that guy, it's the defendant right there. And I know it's him, arrest him or convict him. And that's what happens. And then they rot away in jail for 30 or 40 years. And DNA evidence comes out 30 or 40 years later, overturns their conviction, and they don't get compensation. But I digress. So eyewitness testimony is the worst form of, it's the least reliable form of evidence. So that's the last one from Ponsonby. Keith.
Yeah, my last one was Ponsonby on page 180, saying children's education was not neglected. In La Matin, November 12th, 1915, there was a paragraph headed, "To teachers, all French schools must possess a collection of the cards German crimes in order to impress forever upon the children the atrocities of the barbarians." It went on to say that an artist of note had created a dozen compositions relating to the most striking episodes among the German crimes. Teachers, subscribe today and place these pictures in your schools. So, of course, it's not only targeted at the adults, but to the children. So let's end on a minor white pill. On page 186, he says, "So great are the psychological resistances to war in modern nations that every war must appear to be a war of defense against a menacing, murderous aggressor." So just know that that's what you're going to see almost all the time in the future, is a menacing, murderous aggressor who cannot be reasoned with. Same thing they used for Saddam Hussein, the Kaiser, what they used for David Koresh in Texas. It's not only going to be foreign, it's going to be domestic. And the sad Republican mindset of, yeah, let's go wage this war on terror and give the state all this power to stop the terrorists. Well, they just redefined terror. And not only did the government switch it to now, anyone remotely connected 6 degrees from January 6th is now guilty. The president at the time, George Bush, has come out and implied that they're more or less terrorists for engaging in an unscheduled tour of the Capitol. So, I mean, that is like one of the biggest self-owns. The very president you get. It's not just the system or the group, the government. It's literally the same guy who you cheered all this power going to is now cheering that it be used against you. Sadly, that is the state of affairs, but it's good because what we know that people's precondition is to strongly oppose all this stuff. So if the lies are exposed, then it strongly decreases the likelihood that they'll be able to engage in these actions again.
Yeah, and the emergence of the alternative media, I think, is important in that. Not to break my arm patting ourselves on the back here, but there are a lot of people that are engaged in debunking these war lies, and I think that with the rise of things like Substack and different independent outlets where these people like Rockfin, these are just ones that I use, so I'm naming them, but I think that we're getting more of a fighting chance because in the past, these war lies or the media was so controlled and there were only certain avenues to expose these lies that now we have the ability to expose them in real time. Like, for instance, the last drone strike that occurred in Afghanistan, as it was like the day before everyone was evacuated from Afghanistan, the United States murdered a family of 10, an extended family of 10. On the false intel that the driver at least was a member of ISIS-K, or that he was planning another airport attack. And now we're about 2 weeks removed from when that happened. And at least, I don't know if it's the Times, which leads me to suspect that they have ulterior motives, but there are many outlets who have really grilled the U.S. Department of Defense on this attack. And I wrote a piece about this, and they've not to get too bogged down on it, but it is laughable, the lack of evidence. And I know Rand Paul was grilling. Was it who was the general he was grilling today?
It was Secretary Blinken. So just to give you the quick back and forth. Of course, there's more to every story. So Rand Paul says the guy the Biden administration droned, was he an aid worker or an ISIS-K operative? Secretary Blinken: I don't know because we're reviewing it. Senator Paul says, you'd think you'd kind of know before you off somebody with a Predator drone. So this was today, September 14th, 2001. That's dated. So all this time after, they still don't have a clear fake answer for the public. I was assuming at least they'd have a fake answer. They don't even have that. And it's because, these are more or less based on lies.
Well, and sorry, Keith, this just pisses me off so much because the bullshit that they said that, they're like, well, first, we're getting, several reports that a lot of children were killed in this drone strike. Oh, well, it wasn't us. It was actually ISIS-K because you see ISIS-K packed this vehicle full of explosives, and then we shot it with the Hellfire missile. And after we shot it with the Hellfire missile, it caused a secondary explosion, which blew up a nearby car, and there were children in the vicinity, I guess, maybe, if that's even true. So you get like, it's not our fault because we blew up what we believe to be a car bomb in a thickly populated residential area. You see, it's ISIS-K's fault. And then come to find out that there's no evidence it's ISIS-K. And not only that, but this guy was an aid worker. The president of the American-based aid organization, I forget what they're called, like every plate or every table, some food, it was like a food for starving people kind of relief organization. The president came out and said, yeah, he's been our volunteer, he's been our worker for a long time. He was dropping off fellow aid workers on his way home. And what happened is that he had filled up a bunch of barrels with water, and that's what was in the back of the car. And when he got home, all of his kids came out to greet him because he had been working at the airport for several days. It's my understanding. So, I mean, it's just sickening, man, and it just makes me really mad. So everyone should be mad.
Certainly, some of the most evil people on the planet. This is just a utilitarian case. I mean, if you're already convinced that the existence of a state violates the non-aggression principle, that's not enough to really get you passionate. To know that they murder children and then don't care about it and then lie about it consistently, that should really get you from hating the state logically to just with every fiber of your being, just hating everyone who chooses to associate with them. One of the great lessons of Johann Norberg's book, I think it's titled Progress. It's one of the very last chapters. He says, I've now given 10 reasons to be optimistic about the future of the world with regard to freedom, equality, the environment, decrease in poverty, and, the 10 things altogether. He says, the reason a lot of people don't see this is because the news makes money off sensation. So in order to grab people's attention, they pick something negative. And then when people make decisions, they don't base that decision off of statistics or their long research in a topic. They base that decision on the number of recent examples that come to mind. So if they say, I heard Trump lied about this, and Trump lied about this, and Trump lied about that. Right, we're like in the middle of like politicians lying out of nowhere. Meanwhile, every war is based on a lie, and all politicians since the beginning of time have, lied to secure public opinion. But the reason that people think that this is so new and so unique is simply because that's the number of examples that come to mind. So that's why these atrocity stories matter. So you might think, well, maybe there were or weren't, a couple kids with their hands cut off. So what? It's all about creating a narrative in the mind of the populace to get them to support or at least not resist a war they otherwise might resist. So that's why you didn't see, a ton of, here was the fake statistics. It was all atrocity stories. It wasn't here's the fake statistic that everyone thought they heard. It's never statistics. It's never empirical evidence. It's never peer-reviewed studies. It's always a story to create an image of in your mind in order to create passion in your heart to do things you otherwise wouldn't consider doing. So hopefully we are slowly but surely getting people out of that propaganda mind control mindset.
Yeah, and I'll end on this, Keith. I think it's starting to work because just anecdotally, I think people are very shocked about the Biden vaccine dictates, and a family member of mine who was very much on board with the whole COVID thing is now being like completely against the vaccine because the logical inconsistencies in the propaganda are becoming so contradictory that even those people are identifying that it's all BS. It's like, okay, and I think it's for very practical reasons. Okay, you told me to get the shot, so I got the shot. Or I had COVID already and recovered. Why do I need to wear a mask still? You know, or I got the shot. Now you want me to take another one, and so all those things that we've heard before. So we just need to keep pounding the pulpit and keep exposing these things and hope that we can get it to the most ears as possible. So when another agenda item is pushed, like you said, people will think of the things that we are bringing to light when they make their decision.
Of course, man. Hey, thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone for watching.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. We'll catch you next time. Thanks, Keith.